This is Pacific.ca from the Pacific coast of Canada. Eric Doherty, an environmentalist and instructor at Langara College, spoke about transportation and transformation at the 2012 World Peace Forum. Here is Eric.
This is from the Gulf of Mexico. In this case, it was from extreme deep sea drilling. And I want to actually suggest that we need to take a step back from that, because those problems are actually not the key environmental limits that we're coming up against. It's not the key problem that our system right now is causing. The fact is that the oil that actually makes it to market, makes it into the gas tanks of our sports utility vehicles and minivans and cars and airplanes, and gets burned, and that oil then leaks into the atmosphere. That is really the defining problem that we're facing as a civilization in the medium term. And we can take a look at where in our economy these emissions that lead to situations like that are coming from. Greenhouse gas emissions in Canada, a little bit over half of the emissions that we can measure, those from burning fossil fuels, are coming from the transportation sector. And interestingly, the emissions from producing our fuels, tar sands, fracking, refining oil, that's going up every year because we're getting more and more into the extreme energy, the tar sands and the deep sea oil, rather than the kind of oil that used to be able to drill a hole in the ground and pump it out. I think it's worthwhile to actually consider how we've gotten to this place where half of our emissions are actually coming from transportation. What is it about our system and our history that's got us to this point? Because if you actually think about it, it wasn't very long ago or very far from here where most people got around by walking. This is on Hastings Street, just a few blocks from here. Our cities were built, the historical cores of our cities were built around electric public transit. People got around by walking, by bicycle, by public transit. And until very recently, until after World War II, the automobile was really a luxury. So it's the question, how do we keep the economy growing? And they came up with a very simple answer that turned out to be immensely effective. And the economists of the time, the politicians of the time, were completely open that the movement towards automobility, the introduction of the modern advertising, or the unleashing of the modern advertising industry which had been developing since the 1920s, the introduction of consumer credit, and massive, unheard of public investment in roads. All this was designed to keep the economy growing. And they weren't shy about it, that it was about getting people to produce more, to consume more steel, more rubber, more oil, all of these things that there was too much of at the time. There was a fear, that the oil industry would collapse after the war, that the people working in that industry would be unemployed. To me, it's a really amazing moment in history that we've gotten to this point through this deliberate policy, and the part of this that's still continuing, one of the most interesting parts, is the road building. I don't know if people noticed, but there has been this great controversy in the past about could you create these systems that would not become congested, freeways, free-flowing freeways. That was never the point. The point of these massive investments in freeway infrastructure in the suburbs was to spur on the growth of the capitalist economy, and from a more left-wing, more social democratic position, to produce employment for people working in the oil industry and manufacturing. And so the fact that we built all these freeways and they immediately became congested again, and we're still doing that, isn't a failure of the original project. It just shows how effective it is in convincing people to drive cars. And one of the things that I want to point out that is really key to this is that it's not the spending more money on public transportation, public transit, that's the key to unwinding this program that's cooking our planet. The real key is to stop spending the money on the freeways. I also think it's worthwhile to take a look at where we're going with federal spending. The Harper government has actually put the brakes on transit spending, and they've increased roadway spending. And actually, if you think about this as a pure economic stimulus measure, it actually makes a lot of sense. Stimulate the consumption of a domestic product, tar sands oil. If we didn't have the problem of the climate crisis, and we weren't concerned about pollution or health or any of these other things, if you're only concerned about keeping gross domestic product growing, this would actually make a lot of sense. But if you're actually thinking about human welfare, including jobs, it's actually immensely inefficient. Because this was a way of keeping the economy growing. Right now, if you look at what would happen if you were to start unwinding that, it would have a net benefit in jobs, just because for $1 billion spent on automobiles, there's a lot less jobs than there are in public transit. You drive your own car, a worker drives a bus. Cars are made by robots. People actually make buses. So what I'm proposing, what we're proposing in this transportation transformation paper, is a very simple shift, and which is just to start unwinding this idea of infinite growth and start moving towards an economy that doesn't need to grow in order for people to prosper. The first one is just shifting that money, those billions of dollars a year. Rough estimate, I think federally we could probably shift $10 billion a year out of highway expansion to transit. The other one, which is really key, if you go back to the original slide that I showed of public transit actually going down the middle of our public roads, that's something that we need to take a look at. It's how much of our public space is now devoted to the automobile, is now devoted to spurring the consumption of tar sands oil, spurring consumers to buy automobiles, and actually start putting it over to the kinds of efficient transit, low carbon transit, that also have health benefits. Exercise, less pollution. All those people in those cars, they're not in both of those buses. All those people can easily fit in one of those buses, 76 people. I think you would leave maybe 5 or 6 people standing if they are all in one of those buses. The maximum capacity is over 100 people. And if you think back to that one very simple painted bus lane has more capacity than the rest of the road by far. It's generally one bus lane equals about 5 to 10 car lanes in capacity. And another thing that we talk about in the report is just shifting to electric public transit. And these, those are just trolley buses. They happen to be Mercedes-Benz trolley buses in a busway. But it's not that fancy, it's not that hard to start unwinding this automobile-dominated society, as long as we're willing to take that political step and say, yes, we are willing to reallocate road space away from the automobile to keep us moving in a modern way with much reduced greenhouse gas emissions. And the main way that this works well is grid-connected transportation. That is things like trolley buses and electric trains, where you're not having to store the electricity in batteries and carry batteries around with you. And I actually just like to, one thing that's worth remembering about that is that it was over a century ago, by 1910, we had electric streetcars, a network of electric streetcars in the city of Vancouver and New Westminster on the North Shore. And we also had long-distance interurban trains going out well into the valley, to Richmond, to Coquitlam, all running on hydroelectric electricity. So it's not
Chilliwack, wasn't it?
Yeah. I also just want to talk a little bit about freight. The obvious thing is that we're consuming too much crap. That's pretty obvious. But the other thing is we're moving it by the least efficient modes possible. Most of our goods, consumer goods in particular, are now moving long distances by truck. And we just don't need to do that. We have railways, we have tugs and barges on the Fraser River already that are far more efficient than trucks. I think that earlier in this conference, there's a lot of talk about the big economic systemic changes that we need to make to transform our economies and our society. But I think it's also really important that people think about the nitty-gritty of what needs to happen in my neighborhood in order to get around sustainably, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. What might this look like? And right now we're in a situation where most of the people in Vancouver and British Columbia have really no idea what the available options are. And I think one of the main things is that if people know these options, they will want to implement them. They will want to make this system change that is desirable, very desirable for quality of life and for health, but is also just necessary for the survival of our society and maybe our species.